price of being a founding director. You have to be a timekeeper. Our first speaker was up there, Bill Batchelder, and he's going to give us some history and kind of an overview from a psychological perspective, if I understand the title correctly. Bill?
So I'm not somebody that's working in learning theory today, but I got into psychology because of learning theory originally, and I know a reasonable amount about it, and I followed it, but I thought you would be interested in, since all of the other speakers I think are working on topics that are very much in 2008, if you had some historical sense of learning theory, and also some of the perennial issues that come out of learning theory that I think are probably very relevant today. So this is the agenda for the talk. The first half of it, you won't see much mathematics, and the second half will almost entirely have to do with formalism. I'm going to go back to when learning theory was the most popular area in psychology, and I'm going to select a few individuals out of this period because I think they have a lot to say about what's actually happening in learning theory today. So I'll say a little about behaviorism, which is really why learning theory became the most important area in psychology. And I'll talk a little bit about Thorndike's Connectionism and how he really anticipated PDP modeling, actually, if you read a little bit between the lines. Then I'll talk about Skinner and reinforcement, and then I think I probably reversed these two, and then Tolman and cognition. So let's proceed. So the concern with the theoretical basis of learning goes back all the way, at least to the Greek philosophers. And Plato and his student Aristotle have quite different views on how concepts such as triangle, tree, or liberty were acquired. They were quite different in the way in which they looked at it, even though one really taught the other. Plato really thought that they were already in the mind a priori, and they just needed a little bit of nudging. Possibly sense data could do the nudging, or recollection or reason could do the nudging. Whereas Aristotle believed that humans, but not other animals, actually had innate equipment, but that innate equipment was capable of inducing concepts from experience. You sort of ask me, I tend to suffer from the 60s, and I'm kind of a Platonist in a way, but I would guess that maybe Aristotle is clearly right for something like tree. I rather prefer Plato on triangle, and I'm really not at all sure about liberty. I'm sure you all have other ideas about these things. So we come up with the first issue. I'm going to have about 8 or 9 issues that are going to come up in the talk that I think are relevant to the general field of learning. So issue number 1 is, what does the learner start with? And of course there have been quite a lot of history of that particular question taking different forms, some philosophical and some more scientific. So when we talk about rationalism versus empiricism, or nature versus nurture, genetics versus experience, we're really tapping the same central issue about what it is that the learner starts with. Now there's kind of been a pendulum back and forth over the years as to which of these viewpoints is sort of in ascendancy. Before Darwin, empiricism was on top. That would go way back to the British associationists, and then the period from Darwin to about 1910, innateness was on top. From 1910 to 1960, with behaviorism, empiricism was on top. Nowadays, we keep learning that our brains have special modules and our genes cause us to be what we are. But I have a suspicion that machine learning and its capacity to wheel the various regularities out of statistical data may usher in a reversal back to a more empiricistic point of view. But who knows? Now, the start of scientific learning theory probably goes back to the Russian reflexologists, and the person there to start that movement was Sekhanov, and he was followed by a couple of people, Bekhterev and Pavlov. We know a lot more about Pavlov than we know about Bekhterev because Watson, who had a translator of Russian, they were pretty rare in psychology in those days, just happened to translate Pavlov's stuff, but Bekhterev could easily have been the central person in the study. So this is Sekhanov's book, Reflexes of the Brain. And thought is the middle third of a psychical reflex. It's triggered by the stimulation of the brain. The brain can inhibit or excite reflexes. That is, it can override the strength of the stimulation. You make the stimulus stronger, it doesn't necessarily mean the response is stronger. He did experiments with salt crystals and things like that showing that. And psychology is a new branch of physiology. All behavior can be explained in terms of inhibition and excitation. So that's a pretty strong perspective that he laid out. And it raises the second issue, which is really what is the role of the brain in learning. And it seems to me pretty clear that neuroscientists and computational scientists have pretty much different agendas on this subject. Even brain-style computation, which is a standard in machine learning and PDP and so forth, is certainly not computation by a brain. But I'm going to plead ignorance. I have a feeling there's at least 15 people in the audience that could do a better job of discussing that issue than I could, so I'm not going to elaborate it anymore in the talk. But I do have this abundant faith that long in the century, probably after I'm gone, that there are going to be new types of computation that are going to come from understanding how the brain really does do some of its computation. That we haven't a complete idea of what that's going to be. Well, behaviorism, of course, was the major movement in psychology from about 1915 to 1960. And it was really a reaction within psychology to try to make psychology have a sound scientific base. It was a reaction against all of the talk about consciousness and the brain, and they didn't have windows into the brain in those days, so that they pretty much made up stories about the brain, and certainly about instinct that emanated from Darwin, that characterized German and American psychology. It was a reaction against all of this sort of fuzziness that gave rise to behaviorism. And when it became firmly established in psychology, that's when learning theory became the central field in psychology. Wouldn't have had to be. Behaviorism doesn't necessarily dictate that learning becomes the main subject, but indeed that's exactly what happened. So in American learning theory, every university needed a learning theorist, a Hall or a Maurer or a Skinner or a Tolman or whoever. And then it had to have a lower class of experimentalists that did the basic work, but the theorists would be up there. And really, they created a sort of pecking order, very much like we receive the idea that theoretical physicists, in a certain sense, are in ascendancy over their experimental counterparts. And then, of course, the engineers are just waiting to carry out the complex work that's gendered by the theory. And it affected all areas of psychology. One way to make a career in political science, and I knew of people like this, is to know learning theory. And then you're in political science, and it stations you in a very good position. There were a lot of interdisciplinary groups. I think economics may have been the only field in social science that wasn't impacted substantially by learning theory, although there were a couple of examples in which it did. It certainly, the popularity of it, even by as late as the middle 1950s, seduced me out of a career in chemistry into psychology. But let's talk about one of the eminent early learning theorists, which was Edward Thorndike. And Thorndike had was helpful from a scientific standpoint in making a transition from a sort of philosophical idea of associationism, which goes back to Aristotle and was very popular with Hume and Locke and the other British associationists, because their idea was that the association was between a couple of ideas which lurk very deeply outside of the realm of the observables. Well, the early Thorndike talked about the association between a sensory stimulus and an impulse to respond, but he was worried very much that you don't really get to observe the sensory input, and you certainly don't observe the impulse to respond. So he just completely got outside of the organism and said that the connection was between a situation and a response, both of which are quite objectively measurable. And he developed a theory about learning which really avoided mention of the brain, instinct, and mind, although there was a paper or two that he wrote later in his life where he was invited to confess as to what he really thought about these things, and that was quite interesting. We'll talk about that in a second. In a sense, I think I'll make the case that he sort of anticipated the PDP idea. I'll show you the parallel distributed processing idea. Well, this was the kind of work he did. He rigged up these boxes in which there's a door and a little plate of fish out here, and the cat's inside. And in order to get outside of the door, you got to do something pretty unusual. The ordinary sorts of things like sticking your paw through and trying to open up the gate, it's not going to get you out. And he was interested in how the cats go about solving these problems, and this is the typical data. It's not too surprising. This is over a series of trials. There's a great deal of fluctuation. It's exactly the opposite you'd see if the cat learned the trick. If the cat learned the trick, it might go like this, and then swoop, he would be right for ever after. And that was not what he was observing. So he got the idea that learning was gradual, and these data themselves aren't that interesting, but the theory that he wove out of these data, I think, was quite interesting. He believed that in every situation, an animal has a hierarchy of responses that they can engage in, and over time they'll roll over these responses, and some are stronger than others, so that the animal will be more likely to make responses up higher in the hierarchy. Well, eventually, the cat's going to happen into a rare response that happens to trigger the door open, and that will cause positive reinforcement. Getting out is positive, eating the fish is positive, and he had objective ways of measuring that these things were positive, and that's going to boost that particular response up the hierarchy. On the other hand, if something bad happened after you made a response, negative reinforcement, that's going to lower it in the hierarchy. So quite automatically and without the intervention of mind, these responses were bubbling up and down the hierarchy until eventually the opening trick would get up near the top. So learning is the automatic selecting and connecting of responses to stimuli. Cognition and mind don't enter at all in his theory. Whoops! Wolfgang Kohler comes along. He was a German Gestalt psychologist, and he studied lots of apes solving complicated problems. For instance, inside the field, the reachability field of an ape, there might be two poles which you could fit together and make a long stick. And outside of reachability might be a banana, which the ape wants, and the ape's tied to a pole. And so the ape naturally tries to break the pole and pull away, or reach out and get the banana, or may even pick up a stick and try to get it. None of that types of thing works. That sort of behavior, according to Kohler, in his book Mentality of Apes in 1917, is sort of like what Thorndike was talking about with trial and error and selecting and connecting. But then the ape, in his anecdotal discussions, stopped trying to solve the problem. And after a while, jumped up, grabbed the two sticks, fit them together, and scooped in the banana, which he called insight, and the execution of the solution. And so he formed a sort of a four-step theory of how animals solve problems, in which Thorndike's theory, at best, is sitting at the top of those things. Now, when we think about the legacy of Thorndike, of course he stifled the role of thinking in learning for the success of his work, but he was at least pulled out a little bit by Kohler's study. So later on in life he said, well, how do I explain these Kohler things? Well, maybe there's a kind of mental trial and error in which you imagine the situation and imagine your response and imagine the positive reinforcement, and that's how I tried to account for the insight. But then later on in life, I stumbled into a book back many years ago in which he was invited to write what he really thought about was going on in connection. With his Connectionism. Actually, he had a license to write about what he really thought was going on in the brain, not get penalized by the other behaviorists for doing that. And what he really thought was that the sort of Sherrington telephone switchboard model was in place with input neurons and association neurons and output neurons. These little guys were alive like worms. And if they were satisfied with a positive reinforcer, they tended to freeze up. They liked where they were, but if they were annoyed by a negative reinforcer, they twitched around. And you see the consequences of that would be that the sort of conductivity lines from the input to the output would be modified. And I'm not so sure that's different from some of the synaptic connectivity changes that go on, although he didn't have a he didn't have a particularly strong theory about the neurons. That's pretty interesting insight. So issue number 3, are the laws of learning the same for animals and humans? This was what really characterized this behavioristic movement, that there was one fundamental underlying set of laws of learning from the amoeba on up to the human. In fact, there was a friend when I was a graduate student at Stanford was trying to condition a Venus flytrap according to the Pavlovian principles to see if perhaps these laws might transcend even the animal kingdom. And this is a very opportunistic assumption because, my goodness, if the laws are the same for animals and human beings, why not use the animals? They're more expendable, they don't backtalk you and things of that nature. So there was a lot of work with animal learning. The other thing that happened out of this movement is very influential with when it fizzled out. And you were talking about the tumbling of the articles in Learning. Don was talking about that. There was the idea that eventually when we had these laws, we'd be understand how kids learn to play piano and how they learn chess and how you learn to type right and hit baseballs and language and so forth and so on. Those things would be engineering projects, and the basic theorists would have actually got the laws down. Well, people got tired of waiting because they didn't really get very far, and that sort of broke off a different perspective. Now, probably the most anti-theoretical of the theorists. I mean, he was polemically against having theory. He was somebody who just wanted to observe the world and induce and discover what was happening without imposing his own preconceptions. Was B.F. Skinner, 1904 to 1990. And this is a little bit ironic because William Estes, worked under Skinner for several years. And he was the founder of mathematical learning theory, which was probably the best theoretical development to come out of this period. But Skinner was quite something. He debated Chomsky on language, and most say he lost that badly. And he debated theologians on religion, and he wrote utopian novels and all sorts of things of that nature. And he heads many, many lists as being the most famous psychologist, actually, if you look up these sorts of things. Well, we all, when I shifted out of chemistry, I had to pick up a few undergraduate courses, and one was the psych lab, and so you checked out your rat, and that was great. We should be doing that around here. You could shake the rat up to press that bar in no time flat by just waiting till he got a little closer to the bar and give him some reward, then you put the criterion up a little higher, and he finally is up there pressing the bar like mad. And Skinner didn't really care what the stimuli were that gave rise to these bar pressing. He just wanted to accumulate the records and find out what caused response frequencies to increase and decrease and so forth. And in fact, he claims in a Koch volume where he writes a personal story that he discovered the partial reinforcement effect by accident. His machine that was supposed to deliver food to the rats every time they did something had an intermittent error. And that meant it sometimes worked and sometimes it didn't work, like the slot machine that you might put your money in Vegas. And he came back and discovered that the rat was madly pressing the bar. And he got the idea that maybe the sparseness of the reinforcement might have had something to do with increasing the learning. He wrote a 400- or 500-page book with Förster shortly thereafter, in which it was called Schedules of Reinforcement. And he had chapter and chapter and chapter about all the different stingy ways you could pay off the rat. You know, every 10 times, every 1 minute, mix the 1 minute and the 10 and 7, or all the different ways you could partial out reward, and the different characteristics of the operant curve as a function of that. Well, animals do go for the reinforcement. This was always one of my favorite, the raccoon that was taught to stuff a basketball. Here's a monkey riding a horse. I don't know what this chicken is doing. A couple of chickens are collaborating. Somebody won a Westinghouse talent search in the 60s by training a chicken to play perfect tic-tac-toe. So he could do. Now, there was never anything in the theory that could explain why a horse couldn't play chess. That was a lacking element in the theory. But in any event, it worked, or so it seemed to work. And a big industry formed out of this. This was a major money-making operation, because Skinner actually created ways of helping autistic kids to become more verbal and all kinds of applications of that type, which seemed to work. And there are even therapists today who use Skinnerian techniques in certain kinds of psychiatric problems. But actually, a couple of heretics emerged from among Skinner's students. These are the Keller and Marion Breland, and they were unable to get academic jobs, but they were masterful at training animals. And so they formed a corporation, which was Animal Behavior Enterprises, and made a good deal of money getting animals trained for circus events and all that sort of thing. And then they began to notice something was happening in the work that they were doing. And that the animals, while they could be trained to do all kinds of weird things, after a period of time they tended to lapse back into their own species-specific behavior. And this learning was not something that stuck. So they wrote a famous paper called where do I have it here? The Misbehavior of Organisms, because they're misbehaving according to the Skinnerian theory. And they summarized a lot of findings that contradicted three major assumptions of the animal learning stuff, the learning theory stuff. Namely, that these are the assumptions that they claim don't hold. Animals come into the learning situation with a tabula rasa. That's a term we associate with the lock and the blank slate, so to speak. The differences among different species are unimportant, and any response in an animal's repertoire can be conditioned to any stimulus. These were kind of tenets that fuel the Skinnerian thing. Duncan, if I get more than 30 minutes on this part, I need to shift fairly soon. This part's almost over. We go to formalism.
You've run about roughly 25.
Oh, good. I think we're doing okay then. So this raises issue 4. What is the role of species-specific traits in learning? I mean, this is something that's not paid a lot of attention to, and certainly is not relevant in machine learning, because I assume different machines don't have different species-specific traits. But they avoided ethological studies, not only because they weren't controlled, but the fact that they didn't really respect the fact that the different types of animals might have a natural. I was giving a lecture on this at one point, species-specific defense responses. I was driving in from Laguna Beach to give my little talk to the class on species-specific defense responses, and all of a sudden this chipmunk comes running into the road. I'm driving my car. I said, oh no, I don't want to hit this chipmunk, and it froze. Well, freezing is one of the things that this little critter does when it gets scared. And in some of the learning experiments, running actively in an activity wheel is what you need to do to avoid the punishment, or shuttling in a box. The point is, some animals were learning fast and some were learning slow, not because they were dumber or smarter, but because of the interaction of their species-specific tendencies and the kind of artificial arrangement that the learning theorists had for them. I would say that many people in animal learning today, and there still are people that do this sort of work, would probably argue that species-specific patterns might account for as much or more variance in behavior than that that's due to learning. Well, we come to perhaps my favorite of these learning theorists, which is E.C. Tolman, who's up in Berkeley. The psychology building there is called Tolman Hall, and Tolman was interested in being a behaviorist, but he wanted to find ways to work cognition into behaviorally oriented theories. And so Kohler and Tolman really caused the sea change to take place, and as a consequence, a very much diminution in the number of articles published in learning. A couple of his experiments, ones that he influenced, are pretty interesting. It's a version of the famous Tinklepaugh reward expectancy experiment. Monkey's sitting there in a chair. He's looking up on the stage. It actually wasn't run exactly like this, but the story's a little bit better this way. It's almost the same. He's looking up on the stage, and the experimenter comes in and places a banana under a can. Of course, that's counterbalanced and controlled as it should be from monkey to monkey. And then he leaves the stage, and the monkey is not able to get up on the stage to get the banana. After a period of time, they take the monkey outside the room, and then the monkey comes back in. And the gate opens, the door opens, and the monkey jumps up on the stage, and of course goes immediately to can number 2. Lifts it up and finds a lettuce. There's a hole in the stage, and they swap the banana for the lettuce. And monkeys like the lettuce. They like lettuce, but they like bananas much better. And what the monkey did was didn't eat the lettuce. I would say not behaviorally, because I wouldn't be allowed to say something like that. Threw a bit of a tantrum, looking under the other cans and generally acting with some degree of agitation. So this suggests that, unlike the way Thorndike talked about it, reinforcement wasn't operating automatically to strengthen responses to stimuli in any sort of a mindless way, but actually the animals had a foresight as to what sort of reward they might be expecting to get. Another one, Tolman believed that animals quite naturally build up a cognitive map of their environment. So you get a new cat into your house, the cat goes running around sniffing, finding out what leads to what and so forth. Probably all experienced that. Tolman would say that that was because they were filing in this kind of information to deal with situations that might happen, such as a dog running into the apartment, and then they would know where to go. So this was a nice little experiment by Tolman, one of his students. They built a 3-route maze. Here's the goal box, here's the start box, and the rat can get down from the start to the goal in 3 different ways. The early phase of the experiment, they forced the rat down all the runways equally often, so the rat is an equal experience. And then they cycle into the second phase of the experiment, and they find out for some rats which route they prefer, and they like the straight route, and then this one a little bit more than the roundabout route. But that doesn't refute anything, because the straight route gets your rat into the goal box sooner, therefore the amount of time since you were here that you get rewarded is shorter, and so that should create a stronger habit. No problem yet. Then they block for some of the rats, they cycle them off into different groups. They block the thing right here. And so you can't get there on the straight route. So the rat backs up, and eventually there are 2 other ways that he could get there. He's much more likely to take this route than this route. Well, it doesn't show that he has a map because once again, this route is a somewhat more favorable route than this one because of delay of reward. But if you place the block right here, statistically significant, but not by very much, unfortunately. I don't know if it's been replicated. A statistically significant number of rats will come up to the block and go back, and they will take the only route that will get them to goal, which is the roundabout route. And so that was a phenomenon thought to involve, in a sense, a kind of cognitive reasoning from the thing. So that raises issue 5, which is, does the mind matter? And I think the work of Kohler and Tolman and other people pretty much killed off the idea that there could be general theories of learning without dealing with mental processes. And with that, I think learning ceased really to be a major area the major area in any event. Instead, the same people that were doing and would have probably continued to do learning theory began to get off into various areas of cognitive psychology, which was a new type of psychology in which they studied memory, or learning concepts, or learning to categorize stimuli, learning to attend appropriately to certain stimuli, or learning to make decisions, or reasoning, problem solving, and of course psycholinguistics. So that stops this sort of historical part, and now I want to go in selectively into things that many of you are more familiar with probably than what I just talked about, which are various formalisms that have emerged that are relevant to learning theory. Some of these came from within psychologists that were at the tail end of the learning theory movement that we just talked about. Some of them came within psychology or within cognitive psychology from people that worked in these various areas of memory and classification and so forth. And some of the more interesting ones came from people outside of psychology. And so we'll talk about some of these things now. It's going to be just a selective and somewhat cursory review, and I'll hopefully remind many of you about these, and perhaps they'll come up in some later discussion. So let's start with mathematical learning theory. In the early 1950s, this is where the area of mathematical psychology started. That was the area, really, that and learning theory was what got me into psychology. Naturally, learning theory was the first thing on the agenda for mathematical psychologists because that was the big thing going at the time. And Bush and Mosteller, Bush was a physicist, Mosteller, of course, is a statistician, developed linear operator models of learning, and William Estes, whom I mentioned earlier as having worked with Skinner, along with the help of Patrick Suppes, a philosopher, developed stimulus sampling theory, and those were two major approaches to mathematical learning theory. And the real belief of these people and others who participated in this, Duncan Luce was one of them with a beta model, I'll say a little bit about that maybe later, was that given that we could capture substantive ideas of learning and pose them in the forms of stochastic processes and then use all of the advantages of the development and analysis of stochastic processes to carry out the theory. These are those four players that I mentioned. Give me a break. And those are two important publications, the Stochastic Models for Learning by Bush and Mosteller in '55, and then this is a little bit of an underground tech report, but there are other papers surrounding it. Got published somewhat later in a book. So let me give you a sense of what the linear operator models were by treating this the simplest instance of a linear operator model. So the simplest model was for a discrete trial experiment in which there were two response alternatives on each of a series of trials, such as whether a paradise goldfish goes through the left opening or the right opening in a fishbowl, or whether a rat goes left or right in a maze, or whether a human decides that light A or light B is going to shine, all of those situations. The state variable is a random variable p sub n, which is interpreted as the probability that if a person has this value of the state variable, this is the probability they would make an R1 response on trial n. And following the response, there was a reinforcing event or an informational event. Those were talked about in two different ways. EI designed to increase the probability of RI, depending upon what I was. And the linear operator model, the simple one, had the reinforcers driving the probability, although more complicated models would take a look at what response the person made coupled with the reinforcement. So linear operator model, because if E1 occurs, then the new value of the state random variable is a convex combination of 1 and the old probability. And if the other one occurs, it's a convex combination of 0 and the old probability. And the model has two parameters, namely the initial trial probability and a learning rate. Now the model had a number of properties because the experimenter could engineer basically any sequence of E1s and E2s. And so the model was capable of accounting for behavior and detailed behavior, because you could look at things like the probability you would make response 1 on trial n, given that you made response 2 on n minus 1, and you got an E2 on n minus 1, and you made various forms of sequential probabilities. All sorts of things could be predicted. The data basically were sequences of A1s and of R1s and R2s. And these are three of the consequences, three of the theorems that you could prove from the linear operator model. What if you always reinforce one of the responses? Well, this is not a deep theorem, but you can prove that the Pn will be driven immediately from P1 in a gradual geometric way up to 1 with repeated reinforcements. But the other two are more interesting. The second one was particularly interesting to the psychologists for reasons I'll mention in a second, is if you used a Bernoulli reinforcement schedule so that on every trial there's a probability tau that E1 will be the reinforcing event irrespective of the past history, then the limiting expected probability of Pn is tau. This is called probability matching, and there were experiments being run in all kinds of circumstances in which probability matching was the group average behavior. Even if you took a deck of 200 cards, of which 150 had a little A on it and 50 had a B on it, and you shuffled them up in front of the subject and you plastered it down on a table and you started turning cards, you tended to get approximately that proportion of choices, which of course is economically indefensible act, because if you knew that there were 3/4 of the cards are A's and 1/4 are B's, you better guess, unless you're got a good memory, you might get the last one right for sure. But the point is, you should always guess the more frequent card if you wanted to maximize the number of successes. Estes especially was very happy to see this, because this was a case of psychological behavior that departed from economic behavior. A third property of the model was a little more subtle. It's under a double reward schedule. What happens is you wait for the organism to make their response, and then you tell them they were right. And it was called double reward in those days, although in a sense you could call it uninstructed learning, although in a sense you're instructing whatever they do is okay. And in that case, the model is a bounded martingale and has a limiting distribution almost surely to a random variable with its support entirely in the set 0, 1. In other words, with probability 1, you go off to 0 or 1, even though the expected value stays flat at the original trial probability. So these were three properties of the model, which were tested in the laboratory. And Jack Yellett is actually in the audience and can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe a project that he did as a graduate student at Stanford was to go in with a fairly complicated series of reinforcement schedules to try to test out some somewhat more complicated models than the simple linear operator model. And his particular experimental procedure involved starting out by telling the subjects that they were correct a certain percentage of the time, like half the time, and then in the next block of 100 trials or so, I may get the numbers wrong, you'd tell them they were right 70% of the time, and then you would tell them they were right 90% of the time, and then the final 50 trials you'd tell them they were right all the time. And there were some nice derivations of very complicated statistics that should emerge from this sequence of modifications in the reinforcement schedule. And when the subjects participated in the experiment for the last 50 trials, many of the subjects didn't behave at all like they were supposed to behave. One subject would go left, left, right, right, left, left, right, right, left, left, right, right. And the other subject would go left, right, right, left, 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 right, 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 and various other forms of pattern behavior. And the part I remember the most, because Jack and I were graduate students together, was when you had to tell the subjects about the experiment. So the subjects would come out and you would have to tell them that here's what we did. And they would say, well, I solved the problem. And Jack had to tell them they didn't solve the problem. A couple of them got very angry, as I recall, because the sort of the Humean sense of having found the cause was so strong in these people that anyway, these mathematical learning models attracted some real mathematicians. Sam Carlin at Stanford did some work with it. Learnability did some work on getting the asymptotic properties of some of these stochastic processes. And in 1972, Imprint Norman, who came out of the Stanford lab, published the book Markov Processes and Learning Models, which is very rich and deep in various diffusion approximations to analyzing these models. Mathematical learning theory went away from psychology. It really had a very short existence as psychology turned more over into being cognitive. The interest in mathematical models just almost disappeared. I was talking several times with Pat Suppies over the years about what happened to mathematical learning theory, and I think he would agree with the conclusion that really mathematical learning theory in some ways is still alive and well. It just doesn't sit in psychology anymore. It sits in evolutionary game theory, which various models like I was describing, and also Polya-Ern models and various things of that nature are quite popular. Some of the laws, some of the learning rules that were used to account for human choice behavior, or rat choice behavior, are alive and well in synaptic connectivity changes and things of that nature, neural models, and certainly in engineering, there are models of this particular type. But the psychologists didn't stick with it. Instead, they got into models of cognition, and the same experimental approach was here. In other words, very simple experimental setups. If you're going to study perception, you're perceiving whether the line is straight up this way or curved this way. If you're going to study choice, you study whether it's a choice between a very simple gamble or another gamble. Or if it's memory, you study the memory of a short list of unrelated nouns, things of that nature. In other words, the tasks that people flock to model were always simple instances of more complicated human activities in the same spirit that the animal learning stuff was very simple instances of learning. Memory in particular was a very popular area where modelers flocked because memory in a sense is a little bit like learning. In other words, you have a study period and then you get it tested, and if you do well on the test, it means you learn something during the study, If you do poorly on the test, it means you forgot something from the study. So there's a kind of a dual nature between the way you would test for learning or the way you would test for memory. This is one of my favorite slides. I worked this into a lot of different talks because the lid came off in terms of model building. And this is a partial list of memory models that came out of that period. The modal model, the trial-dependent forgetting model, the multiple copy model, the two-element pattern model, and on and on and on. And then there were some big things that could create little models, Sam and Minerva and Array. I'm not saying some of these are good, some of them are bad. Most of them are discarded into the junk pile. And one of the areas I'm working in, actually, is that I'm recovering some of these things and making them into psychometric assessment tools. In other words, it's not as necessarily the right model of learning, but maybe a useful model for measuring latent variables, because they all got checked out in certain circumstances. But I don't know of any area in science. Maybe you can help me with one that has created more models than the early cognitive models of memory. So, what can we learn from modeling simple situations? That's really my sixth issue. Almost all the work I've discussed so far really involves modeling very, very simple, streamlined situations. That's the way experimental psychologists operate. It seems to me there's been an implicit assumption in most of this work that understanding simple artificial situations is the key to understanding real human cognition. There's been very little concern with understanding how these simple situations would scale up to things that actually happen in real life. And mostly outside of psychology, some pretty powerful formal ideas in the area of learning took place, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about towards the final parts of the talk. And of course, before I do that, I should mention that all of these things some of these things are still alive and well. For instance, Alan Newell had a sort of computer architecture called SOAR, a project called SOAR, in which he had a sort of computer architecture where you could set up a cognitive experiment, and then you could find a series of programming production system arrangements that would predict data in the experiment. It was a model-making programming language. And later on, I'm going to talk about the problem with some of these things may be that what can they not do? I mean, one wonders about that. But that would come up later. But I was very surprised to discover that this approach is certainly alive and well. Here's a picture of the attendees of the SOAR workshop 2008. SOAR is a funny title. Is Mark Stivers here in the audience? I don't see him. It's very hard to find out what this stands for, because finally he was able to discover. I think it's something like stimulus, operate, and respond. I think that may be what it stands for, or something of that nature. Then John Anderson, who is currently a very active theorist, also at Carnegie Mellon. Both of these people are very famous. And Anderson built a kind of comprehensive system of human action and memory and learning and perception, using, among other things, the tools that Newell had in production systems. And here is the ACT-R Summer School 2008. So there are remnants today of the kind of cognitive modeling that I've been talking about. Now I'm going to push outside of psychology and talk a little bit about some of these things. It would be hard not to talk about Noam Chomsky, and he and some other people, Zelig Harris maybe and Schulzenberg or some, contributed to finding a connection between the theory of computing machines and the theory of grammars. And this is this so-called Chomsky hierarchy from simple to complex. And he had a tremendous influence. Of course, his influence goes all the way back to where he took on B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior, where he tried to describe, Skinner tried to describe how language could be learned by reinforcement principles. And Chomsky wrote a book review, which was almost as long as a book, concerning the difficulties of that particular approach, and that made him get on the map when it comes to psychological learning theory. And he made a very strong argument that the complexity of human language was certainly requiring innate capacities in the learner. And his argument really was based on a lot of things, but putting it very simply, kids learn language pretty early in life. Language, if he's right in how he describes it, is as complicated, more complicated than Boolean algebra and things that you have to kick college students to learn. So how is it that they learn that early, especially when they don't have any idea which language it is that they're going to be learning, so they have to pick the language out of a set of all possible human languages. And if that set was huge, it would seem impossible to imagine how data that they could acquire would allow that selection. That was the rough idea. Now, E. Mark Gold published a very influential paper in 1967. I think some of you are probably familiar with the paper, which he took on and tried to take on formally the problem of language identification, language learning. And his formalism is very simple. You've got an alphabet, then you've got finite strings from the alphabet, then a language is just a subset of the finite strings, and then a collection of languages is a subset of languages. And so Gold imagines that a learner what Gold tries to do is answer the question, can a learner learn a class C? Under various assumptions about how they could be getting positive and/or negative instances and various other sorts of presentational schemes. And he comes up with quite a lot of negative results in the sense that if the class is such and such, and if the stream of evidence is such and such, then the learner could not pick the language out of the class. That paper had a tremendous influence in some circles, including some in linguistics. In fact, it was very popular when I first came to Irvine in the early 70s. Henry Hamburger, Ken Wexler, Peter Kullikover were working very hard on applications of goal-like thinking to the problem of linguistic theory. They wrote a book, Formal Principles of Language Acquisition, which is a very, very thick book, and they have a very slow-moving Markov model that trots through all the possible things subject to certain universal restrictions on what you can actually get to, and they prove in the limit that language can be learned, but unfortunately what Chomsky takes to be language is a moving target. So once they had the book out, it wasn't quite the language that they were supposed to be learning, but at least they were motivated very much by the Gold result. Now, one of the people here in our school, Kent Johnson, in Logic and Philosophy of Science, has written a wonderful paper, Philosophy of Science 2004, in which he describes some of the abusive interpretations of Gold's results in cognitive science. In other words, people have really overplayed that. But the setup, the way of thinking, I think is an important way to try to tackle some of the bigger issues. Then one of my favorite areas, taught it several times, is the book called Perceptrons by Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert. And perceptrons, as some of you may know, refer to simple learning machines that were really around for rather a long time. Rosenblatt, some other people had these machines. And what Minsky and Papert tried to do was formalize the character of these machines in such a way that you could prove various theorems. And of course, the simplest kind of perceptron was sort of a point predicate perceptron. This is where you just pick up individual elements in the retina, and then you can try to tie them together with certain logic, and it's very easy to show that there are great limitations in what such a point predicate perceptron could pick up. There are almost no limitations in what an arbitrary perceptron can pick up. And so what I always liked about the work, and I understand it was controversial, I have a slide on that in a second, but was that it was the effort to pose it in a formal way, in such a way that you could say, this thing can learn this and can't learn that, and if we raise its character, it can learn what it couldn't learn before. In other words, these kinds of knife-edge theorems about what things can and can't do, it seems to me, is an important, and it's also in the spirit of what Gold did. Now when we go to brain-style computation, we would start, as Minsky and Papert did when they reviewed the history in their book, with the McCulloch-Pitts neural networks, and we've all learned those, and they're equivalent to finite automata. Minsky has a nice book, Computation, Finite and Infinite, in which they show that. But they were primarily interested, if I understand things correctly, Louis parents could correct me if I'm wrong, they were interested in how brains could understand the sorts of things that are in McCulloch, in Russell and Whitehead's Principia Mathematica more than they were in learning. So for instance, when they lay out the principles of their nets in the famous paper, The Logical Calculus of the Ideas of Immanence and of the ideas immanent in nervous activity, the fifth assumption is the structure of the net does not change with time. Well, they knew it could change with time. They relegated that particular issue to a later, that was off the table because of the tremendous power of what they were doing without getting into the learning. Got 5 minutes, but yeah, I'll make it. Then within psychology, and I think I was David Rungelhart was a student at Stanford when I was there. We did research together, and we played duplicate bridge together. And Steve Grossberg came along and developed some very complicated linear, nonlinear differential equation systems, a sort of very complicated. And I remember Dave was not impressed at all with these things, and then I lost track of him, and he came back when I moved out to Irvine, and he said, we were wrong. These things are pretty important. And of course, what happened down in San Diego is a fascinating development in collective activity to create the parallel distributed processing, and the couple of books that they had along with the PDP group. I think one of the people here was on that committee. And so you could view, somebody like me could view, maybe a more of a formally oriented person would have trouble doing it. But somebody like me could view this as a version of Thorndike's idea of neural computation, or maybe what McCulloch-Pitts would have done had they made their nets learn. Now these guys started out in a very traditional cognitive psychology way, namely they took on some experiments that nobody could explain in cognitive psychology. You flash up briefly, statistically, either this one or this one. They know they're going to see word or work. Their only job is to bang a D or a K button. Another trial, same subjects, they're only seeing a single letter, D or K, and they have to hit a left or a right thing. And they're faster at detecting D or K when it's with a word than when it's with a letter. And very, very clever experiments were done by McClellan to rule out every possible artifact in that kind of explanation. It's a real phenomenon, and that gave rise to the idea that maybe you have processors that are operating at word levels, letter feature levels, and there's cooperative computation going on, and they showed that such a system could actually explain this, and that really caused psychologists to become very interested in it. And a number of the people that were in the PDP group, very, very talented computationists, and they've carried PDP forward till it now has had a huge impact both within and outside of psychology. I remember getting a very strange phone call. I taught this stuff, but I don't even do computers. I don't know how to do computers. But I taught the stuff because I like the formalism. Somebody called me up wanting me to consult on some actuarial problem. They wanted me to, because they heard about it, and they heard that I knew something about it, and they wanted me to help with counting, which I had to turn down, even though it was a lucrative opportunity. But there are many, many things that this, certainly it had a big impact on statistics. Classification, they could deal with certain types of nonlinear regression in statistics that nobody could have done before. So a major theoretical issue for people like me is what can't PDP do? What can't the Grossberg nets do? What can't the SOAR system do? What can't ACCAR do? And so that gives rise, I'm not saying there are things. Oh, there's another issue. There are two issues that emerge, and I'm finishing up, I think. Are negative results valuable? I know that there were certain political issues associated with the perceptron because Minsky and Papert apparently, and I wasn't involved with trying to do it, had some impact in stifling grants that might have led to flourishing applications of the PDP in various areas. And that was attributable in part to the so-called negative results that they evidenced in their book. But at the same time, I think from a scientific standpoint in the theory of learning, it certainly raises an important issue that when you're proposing a system for learning in a scientific sense, as opposed to a get-the-job-done sense, it's important to have a clear sense of what it can and can't do. Certainly the Chomsky hierarchy, the Gold's theorem, and the perceptrons have that feature. Finally, do it like humans or do it the best you can. And so I'll close with a little bit of personal information. As a former strong chess master, former is an important word there, and a pretty good Go player and a pretty good bridge player, I played fairly close to the evolution of computer game playing over the years. And in fact, at Stanford, I was training to help McCarthy's program to try to go after Botvinnik's program. I had to play with a queen odds against it, and we never got too far with that. Zobrist had an award-winning dissertation for developing a Go machine in 1970 at the University of Wisconsin. I was on his dissertation committee. Came in one morning to play a game against it, and he said, well, you have to give it 13 stones. 13 stones is like a queen and a rook. Started playing with it, 50 moves in, it had gotten better. It had improved its position. Then I decided to attack it, and it fell apart. The point is that it was operating on pattern recognition and trying to capture certain elements of what humans were doing. Hans Berliner, somebody I know well from chess competition, he was at Carnegie trying to get a good chess program, and indeed trying to build in some human properties into the program. But Deep Blue wasn't built out of human things. Brute force was a winner. So to get a good program to play games, clearly, I was recently in a dissertation with Pierre Baldi, who had a student doing machine learning in a small Go board. Here, brute force wins. So, can machine learning inform scientific learning theory, I think is my final question. But I know in my own work, I love machine learning. I've used plenty of Monte Carlo sampling algorithms, simulated annealing, the EM algorithm, the Hastings Metropolis algorithm, various kinds of MC. All of those have helped me in my statistical work. But I think an issue is to what degree the machine learning will, and in what ways will inform the scientific developments in learning. That's my...
Okay, we've got 10 minutes for discussion. We're running essentially 5 minutes behind Paul's schedule, you see, and I'm just going to keep it at that. Go ahead.
I've got a bunch of these. I didn't want to pass these out before. This is one of the stories, but if you want to see the, if anyone's interested in the talk, they can pick up. Yeah.
You didn't say anything about the controversy between the Sufis and Arvin.
You mean the automata controversy?
Yeah, I mean, there was a famous exchange, very controversial exchange between the two, which seemed to be central.
Sufis was wrong. I mean, basically, I believe it's the same controversy.
Yeah.
Sufis had an idea that stimulus sampling theory had the computational capacity of of a high-level machine, as opposed to being a finite automaton. And he had various ways of redefining the primitives of a stimulus sampling theory in a way in which he thought he could prove. But Carius came along actually and showed that that was incorrect. And I have a chapter on Supi's contributions to the foundations of psychology with Ken Wexler, which we discussed that. I think in that particular instance, Pat was...
yeah, that was my
right. Yeah.
impression.
The other is that stimulus sampling theory doesn't have that much computing capacity.
Rui?
Yes, you did not mention Hopfield, the Hopfield net. You know,
Hopfield,
John Hopfield,
right.
you know, the recurrent net, John Hopfield, which is a powerful net for learning, using feedback.
Yep.
You did not mention that.
Didn't mention it, no.
Why?
Well, I just barely made the time. There was a time when I introduced that into a class I taught. It's been quite a long time ago. And so
One of the things that he uses in the proof of convergence, learning is convergence, of course, try to converge to the right solution. He uses the Lyapunov function.
Lyapunov function.
Have people use Lyapunov function in proving convergence in learning? In mice and things like that.
In the convergence results that I'm familiar with, in things like the beta model, linear operator model, and things of that nature, I don't recall the Lyapunov function being used as part of the conversion.
Martingale theory is Lyapunov, is stochastic Lyapunov theory. So in Martingale
Is it?
all the
Yeah.
time.
The Lyapunov function, the so-called Lyapunov energy function.
So in Martingale theory, you have a Lyapunov supplement, but it's for stochastic process.
Yes.
And those are used all the time. So
Yeah.
So this field is not stochastic. Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll answer your very accurate description of that all learning experiment. This is the experiment in which the subject's trying to guess whether you're going to say A or B, and the computer's going to start with A or B on the next trial. You did this to hundreds of trials. And unbeknownst to the subject, let's say in a block of those trials, 100 or so, it's going to come up A 75% of the time, regardless of what the subject predicts. And then we can start another series of trials, subject to the only change, in which the subject would be correct, say 75% of the time, whether they said A or B. And these mathematical learning models, the stochastic learning models, predicted just exactly what the group average data would look like. But then when we let the subject be correct all the time, so no matter what they said, the computer said, yeah, this gave them that response. Yes, that's correct. Then we discovered that they all had these hypotheses, some complicated, some simple. And so each subject was not behaving at all like the stochastic model that was supposed to be determined. But the group average data still looked exactly like the stochastic model. So the stochastic model was right at the level, in some sense miraculously, was able to describe the group properties, but didn't describe any of the individuals at all. It was not descriptive at all of what the subjects were actually doing. So I was very, at that point I thought, well, I should come up with a model that could explain that kind of, it's really sociological, social psychological phenomenon, but I was never bright enough to do it. Maybe it's someday this week. Think again. I think it's a problem that would still be. And now we have a lot more sophistication.
Right.
There is this well-known difference between learning with a teacher and learning without a teacher. Learning with a teacher and learning without a teacher.
Right.
Can you comment on that?
I mean, uninstructed learning and instructed learning, yeah.
I don't know the psychological language.
Can you explain, can you specify what you mean by teacher?
Teacher
Because a machine can teach you too.
No,
So what
teacher means that you provide inputs,
you provide reinforcement.
Yeah, reinforcement. Reinforcement, under supervision. Of course, it has to be under supervision.
Well, I guess the earliest instance I'm familiar with uninstructed would be Thorndike's law of exercise, in which he assumed that if you engaged in a response, that created a small increase in the likelihood you'd make the response to the stimulus. The double reward result in the In the linear operator model, I would interpret it as a type of uninstructed learning result. And I do know in the PDP stuff, especially some of the people, there's a, gosh, I dropped her name. She's down in San Diego, and she's in brain and computation. And she has some multimodal work in which non-instructed learning is playing a big role, I think. So I think people are surprised. I'm not an expert in the area, but people are very surprised by how much of cognitive activity could evolve from a type of non-teacher or uninstructed.
David Cooper at Brown. David Cooper at Brown. He recently retired from Brown University. He is the main proponent of the probabilistic models for learning without supervision.
Any other comments?
Just an historical comment. Of course, you cannot cite all the people that have contributed to this, but I think one idea that is simple, bold, but has still a lot of strength is the idea of head. Because neurons that are deep in the brain, they have no understanding of chess or whatever you are doing, right? So there has to be mechanism for adjusting neurons deep in the brain that are sort of capable of doing that without being directly in touch with the input or the output.
Neurons that are coactive tend to strengthen.
It's very basic. It's a very simplistic idea, but I think it has that.
Absolutely.
Common fact.
I think we'll take a break